Hey friends! So sample rate may be the most misunderstood and misinformed topic in all of music production. Not understanding or utilizing sample rate correctly can degrade your mixes. So in this video, I'm going to go over where using high sample rates really matters and where it really just doesn't. I'm going to back up every single thing that I say in this video with audio examples and explanations, so please use headphones or full-range speakers in order to listen to what I'm about to show you. So the first thing to understand is that there are two completely different things that we could be referring to when we talk about sample rate, and it's extremely important to clarify which one of those things we mean. Do we mean the sample rate of the exported final audio file that can be listened to by our fans, or do we mean the sample rate of the session that we're running in our DAW? Or in other words, the sample rate of the audio processing itself? The first claim that I'm making is that there is no audible difference between listening to an audio file with a 44.1 sample rate versus any higher sample rate such as 48, 96, and up. If you don't believe me, please watch the rest of the video and I'm sure by then you'll understand why. The second claim that I'm making, though, is that running a DAW session at increasingly higher sample rates absolutely does have an audible effect, especially when using nonlinear effects such as distortion and compression. Now, there are some caveats to the second claim when it comes to using oversampling and other things, but we'll get into that in the video. I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers with this video, but my intention is not to be controversial, but rather helpful. My goal with this video is to give you clear guidelines and actionable practices that you can incorporate into your own workflow to get the best audio quality in your mixes, and to answer the age-old question, what dang old sample rate should you be using in your DAW sessions? Whether you're a seasoned pro or a beginner, I'm sure you'll learn something from this video, especially those of you who stick it out and watch the whole thing. So let's get to it. So what we're looking at here is 3 different exports of the same track. Now the way that I exported these was not by going into the export dialog and choosing a different sample rate. What I did instead was I actually changed Ableton's native sample rate that it's running right here. So at the moment it's at 48, but what I did is I went into my settings and then I chose the sample rate that I wanted to run the set at, okay? And so that's the first thing I want to differentiate. There's a difference between having a waveform at a certain sample rate and then running a DAW at a sample rate, okay? Before we get into all the nitty-gritty of that, let's just go ahead and do a little listening test, okay? So let's listen to the original set. This is what was intended. I feel like I should add that this test audio that you're about to listen to is grainy and filtered on purpose because it helps us hear the potential problems that can come up when we process it at different sample rates. So I'm going to repeat a really short phrase of time so that we can listen to the minute differences between these exports. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bounce back and forth between the 44.1 and the 48, starting with the 48. Do you hear that? Do you hear that low, garbly kind of noise that's being introduced? It's okay if you don't. This is something that you really have to listen closely for, but I'm going to make it a lot more apparent. So let's go ahead and now we're going to jump back and forth between the 96K export and the 44.1 export. Now remember, when I'm saying export, what I'm meaning is that the set was ran at 96 and the set was ran at 44.1. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this, and you'll start to notice that there is some garbly-gook happening in the low end. Take a listen. Now I'll go ahead and switch between all 3. And now what I'm going to do is on the main, I'm going to turn on this filter right here so we can just listen to the low end. So what is happening here? What is this garbly-gook that's happening at these lower sample rates? Well, again, this is a subtle thing, but if you hear it, what you're hearing is actually called aliasing, okay? So the first thing to understand is that when you are using saturation and compression, you're creating harmonics, okay? And when you run at a higher sample rate, or you do oversampling, which we're going to get to, if you run at a higher sample rate, that grainy, gritty aliasing that can happen in your mix will go down and down and down the higher the sample rate that you use. So with that example, I've addressed my second claim that as a general rule, running your DAW session at increasingly higher sample rates will yield less and less unwanted aliasing distortion in your mix. But that's not the whole story here. There are certainly caveats to running higher sample rates and other considerations that I'll address later in the video. But now I want to address the first claim, and that's that listening to audio files at different sample rates at 44.1 and above makes no audible difference. Let's do it. So to explain this properly, we need to briefly discuss something called the Nyquist limit. This is the highest frequency that a digital system can produce, and it's always half of the sample rate. So for 44.1, the highest frequency that it can create is 22 kilohertz. For 48K, the highest it can produce is 24 kilohertz, and for 96K, it's 48 kilohertz. So just stop and think about this for a moment. Unless you're a bird or a dog, you can't physically hear anything above 20 kilohertz. So therefore, an audio file at 44.1 should be more than sufficient to cover the entire audible listening range for humans. In fact, most adults can't perceive any sounds above 16K. This is why MP3 and other types of audio compression use low-pass filters to save bandwidth and data. I wish that I could demonstrate in this YouTube video by playing a sine sweep from 10K to 20K. Where the upper range of your own hearing ends would likely blow your mind, especially if this whole time you've been thinking that you can hear all the way up to 20 kilohertz. But unfortunately, even here on YouTube, and depending upon your data connection and because of their compression, likely this video player won't even play any audio above 16K, which would make a test like that meaningless. Okay, so now that you know that a 44.1 sample rate can produce frequencies well above your own hearing range, let's listen to a comparison. Okay, so I'm going to switch my Ableton session sample rate to 96K. You can see 96K up here. Now check this out. I'm going to go up to my export dialog, and I'm going to choose 44.1 as the sample rate that I'm going to downsample this export to. So basically it's saying the project will be rendered at 96K and downsampled to 44.1. So check this out. Let's go ahead and drag this audio into here. Now let's listen to the difference between the 96 and the 44.1. So what do you hear? Trick question. It's not any different at all. It's not different whatsoever. These are almost precisely the same audio file. Why? Okay. Hopefully you've been paying attention. Why would this audio, see how my mouse is hovering here? It says 44.1 over it, and then this says 96K down there. Why do these sound identical? Because the highest frequency, okay, that a digital system can create at 44.1 is what? 22K. The reason you can't hear the difference between these is because any differences between these two audio files are much, much, much higher in frequency than you can hear, okay? So a real quick word from our sponsor, which is me. I actually offer a full online course in mixing and mastering with Ableton Live where I delve even deeper into this and many, many, many other topics that help you get professional sounding mixes quickly and efficiently. My ratings are through the roof, and that's because these courses offer the most thorough training in Ableton Live available. Okay, let's get back to it. So now that you understand that an audio file's final sample rate doesn't really need to be any higher than 44.1 to be able to play back the full listening range, let's now get a little more granular and focus on where sample rate really does matter in the audio processing stage. Here are some actionable recommendations and guidelines when it comes to working with sample rates in different scenarios. Let's start with oversampling. While it is true that higher sample rates will yield less and less distortion the higher you go, I still generally recommend that folks use 48K as the sample rate in their DAW. And this is because of a nice little feature called oversampling. Within Ableton Live, we have a feature in many of Ableton's effects, mainly the non-linear ones, called high quality mode. This is essentially Ableton's word for oversampling. What oversampling actually means is that the audio itself is upsampled to a higher sampling rate while it's inside of a plugin or device, and then downsampled back to the session's native sample rate when it leaves the device. This ingenious feature is found across many different plugins and has different names, but it's essentially all oversampling. The reason oversampling is so ingenious is that running a set at 88.2 or 96K or higher is pretty taxing on standard computers. Unless you have a beast of a machine, you'll find that generally running at higher sample rates will lower the amount of tracks and plugins that you can run simultaneously in your project. But thanks to oversampling, you can essentially run some plugins or Ableton devices at higher sample rates and gain the benefit of higher quality sound without pushing your computer as hard. Now, there are a few caveats with oversampling, and one of them is that turning it on will inevitably take more of your computer's resources to run, and two, there will most likely be a little bit of latency added to the project when you turn oversampling on. But again, the benefits greatly outweigh the cons. So now that you know about oversampling, let's do a listening test to compare some exported audio. So like I was saying, on many of Ableton's nonlinear processors, if you right-click on the title bar, you'll see a high-quality switch that you can turn on or off. Essentially what this does is it engages or disengages oversampling. And you'll notice that if I engage it on glue compressor, it adds about 0.67 milliseconds of latency, which is legitimately nothing. It's so small. This is such a small amount of latency. But the benefit is that you get 2x, 4x, who knows, however much oversampling. So let's say, for example, if it was 2x, if it is 2x, my set right now is running at 48K. So that means that while the audio is being processed by this glue compressor, it's actually being processed at 96K. Now, Ableton has not disclosed what level of oversampling there is going on when you turn on the high quality switch. But what I've done is I went ahead and I ran my set at 48K, and I did an export where I turned off all of my high quality switches. So none of these switches were running for an export. And in the main or master track, I had an instance of FabFilter Pro L2. And if you know anything about FabFilter, they have their own oversampling, and it's very flexible. You can actually choose different levels of oversampling, and I had this turned off too. So I did an export at 48K without any oversampling in the set. And then I went back and turned oversampling on for the FabFilter Pro L. I think I used 8X. And then for all of the instances of Ableton devices where you could turn it on, I turned that high quality switch on, and then I did an export there. Then I changed my session sample rate to 96K. And then I did an export where I didn't have any oversampling on. And then I did an export where I had it at 96 and I used all the oversampling options. So we have 4 different files to compare. So let's compare them. So here we can see clearly labeled, we have our 2 48K exports, and then we have our 2 96K exports. Now, crucially, remember, I'm talking about running the session at 48 and running the session at 96. And one more thing I ought to point out is that I really pushed the Pro L limiter very, very hard. I actually had some gain reductions of like -12, okay? I did this on purpose. I'm really trying to push a bunch of audio through these processors to make them work really hard so that we can hear the benefits, if any, of using oversampling or using higher sample rates, okay? Let's go ahead and take a listen. So this first track, as you can see labeled here, has no oversampling and it's at 48. So this should be the lowest quality track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bounce back and forth between listening to this track and then this track. I'm going to go ahead and loop this, and we're going to listen to any potential gains from using oversampling, because on this track, as you can see, I utilized oversampling in all of the devices that allowed it. Now, this is extremely subtle, but I actually hear that there is less graininess in the mids and highs than there is with the oversampling on. I'll actually use a filter to accent that effect here in a moment, but now let's go ahead and add in the no oversampling at 96 and then the oversampling at 96 to our listening comparison. So again, these differences are very subtle, but let's go ahead and we're going to go to my main track here, and I'm going to turn on a filter. Essentially what I'm doing is we're just listening to the highs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just isolate this little spot right here. We're going to take a listen right here. Now, can you hear a little bit of graininess in there? Check this out. When I go to the oversampling at 48 track, take a listen. Notice how that graininess is gone. Let's go back and forth. Right? Isn't that surprising? So just turning on oversampling at 48K really helps clean this audio up. Let's take it a step further. Let's listen now. Let's start adding the 96K. So essentially, this would be akin to turning on a 2x oversampling on everything in the set. Let's take a listen to this one now. So as you can see, there's a clear benefit to running the set at 96K here. But check this out. Now we're going to compare all three of these. So starting with the grainy one, 96, and then 48 with oversampling. Isn't that interesting? The oversampling at 48 is actually the least grainy of all three of these audio files, right? Isn't that wild? Now remember, running my set at 96K takes a lot more resources of my computer. It has to process a lot more data, right? Now let's go ahead and add the oversampling at 96K. Now this will be unfair because oversampling at 96K, you're just not going to get any distortion at all. Huge difference there. Now let's take a listen to the 48K and the 96K with oversampling. Extremely minute difference. I don't even know if YouTube is able to even play to you audio at a high enough quality to even be able to hear the differences here. But I still hear a small gain by using 96K with oversampling on. But again, is it worth the processing power? Is anyone that's ever listening to your music at home ever going to be able to hear the difference? I don't think so. So this is why I still generally recommend that most users, unless you have a really good computer and you have a nice studio with all kinds of conversion happening and you're mastering someone else's music and stuff like that, unless that's what's happening, I still recommend that you use 48K and you use oversampling whenever the option presents itself. And another benefit I should add is that you actually don't need to use oversampling when you're kind of in the writing phase and you want to keep your latency down. You can make your song and do all kinds of stuff, and then you go into the mixing stage. That's when you can turn on oversampling and squeeze out that last little extra bit of quality from your mixes, okay? Awesome. So I hope you understand oversampling and how powerful it is. So knowing what you know now, you might be tempted to change your sample rate to a much higher rate at the last minute right before you export your project in the hopes that your mix will now sound pristine. Let me quickly show you why this is probably not the best policy. Here's another part of the song. So here is the original mix and what I want it to sound like. Let's go ahead and go to 44.1. So something weird is happening with the clap, and that's an example of the fact that the clap is actually made by a synth. And that synth running at a different sample rate, it's actually creating or outputting slightly different audio, okay? So another lesson that I want you to take away from this video is that if you have created a set at a certain sample rate, if you at the very last minute change your entire Ableton set to be running at a different sample rate up here, MIDI synths and other types of processors are going to sound different. Let me prove it again. So go ahead and take a listen to the 48 mix. Now check out the 96. So not only do the claps sound different, they have a different flavor. They're not necessarily worse or better. It's just different. It's not what I intended, right? The mid-range of those claps has changed. If you listen closely, you'll also hear that the main bass, that ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, that thing, it also has a different tone to it as well. I'll go ahead and go back and forth between them. So even if the 96K mix sounds potentially a little bit cleaner in this example, that's not what I'm going for. The 96K mix now sounds completely different, Okay? Now, the completist in me makes me want to mention that there are a few more obscure reasons you may want to occasionally record and run your DAW at higher sample rates. One of them is when doing extreme pitch shifting, such as taking a sample and pitching it way down so that crickets, for example, sound like an orchestra or something. You'll definitely want to record and process the sample at the highest sample rate that your system can use so you have more data points, which will equate to less graininess in the resulting stretched audio. And another perhaps less obscure reason to use higher sample rates is when you're processing a vocal take and you find that you need to use Melodyne or Autotune or Ableton's AutoShift. These kinds of plugins benefit from having a lot of data points to work with in order to get the best, most believable results. So to review, here are the most important takeaways from this video. 1. The higher the sample rate, the less unintended aliasing distortion that you'll have in your mix. So use the highest sample rate that still allows you to do work and not get hindered by running out of computer resources. Again, for most of you, at this point in 2025, with modern computers, that's 48K. But that brings me to number 2, take advantage of oversampling, or in Ableton's case, use high quality whenever it's available. Number 3, use the same sample rate for the entire duration of the mixing phase of your project, or else unintended changes can occur to your sounds. This also applies to number 4, which is to export your set at the same sample rate of the session and then downsample afterwards because, number 5, you can't hear the difference between printed audio bounced down to 44.1 versus any higher sample rate. So I would be remiss not to mention another video that you should watch by the legend that is Dan Worrall, where he more or less discusses what I've shown you here, but does it in a more visual way, where he uses a spectrogram to show you what aliasing actually looks like and the benefits of oversampling. Also, watching his videos is akin to having like Gandalf or David Attenborough give you mixing tutorials. Highly recommended. Anyway, I hope that you found this video useful and you feel more confident moving forward with sample rates. If you enjoy this kind of thing, please give me a sub and ring the bell so you know when I post more stuff, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.